kind of fix that. Remember, we needed divs because divs are block level and you can apply background images. So how do we apply background images to spans? What we do is we actually set the display value on this to display block, and we force it to be block level element, and then we can put a background image on it. But the CSS then is independent of HTML, and so it doesn't violate the HTML standards anyway. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so let's just look at the CSS. So here's the CSS for the 3 divs. And you can see just background image, and these corners are going to have no repeat because we just want that image to appear once. And the middle one, we're going to set repeat text. Okay, and that's just going to take that small little sliver of the image that we have, and it's going to fill out the entire contents of that HTML element. Okay? And then the new attributes that I talked about were display block and float, and I'm going to talk about what float and display block means. Do you guys have any questions about this background image or background repeat here? We'll be covering this in lab too, so you guys will have a little bit of time to work with it. Okay. So let's talk about the CSS display value really quickly. The display value basically lets you, set if an element should behave like its block element or an inline element. And you can also set the value of it to none. And what none does is it actually hides that object entirely. So it removes it from the document flow and it makes it not visible. And that seems kind of silly, right? Why would you want to set the display value of your HTML element to none? There's actually applications for that later when you're kind of doing JavaScript. And with JavaScript, what you can do is you can dynamically change that display value. So you can kind of make things appear that weren't there before after you click a button, or hide things after you click a button. And what's really important is just because we can override the behavior of that element in CSS, you still have to follow HTML standards. So when you're coding your HTML, you still have to just make sure that the HTML, the block level elements only appear inside other block level elements, and that inline elements only appear inside block level elements, right? Does that make sense? So the HTML document, independently of your CSS, has to conform to the block and inline rules. You guys okay? Okay, so here's just a quick demo of display none. Okay, so there's 2 divs here, and I'm using inline styling. And the first one is just no display value set, and the second one is essentially the same thing as the first one, except it has display none. Okay. And if we just view this in HTML, if we just view the document in our browser, it's going to look like that. So that doesn't look too interesting. So there is that other div, okay, and it's just basically being hidden with the display value. So if I hide it, or if I remove the value, then it shows again. And if I disable it, then it's okay. So if we go back to this example, you notice that we're actually not using any positioning here. We're not using position absolute or anything on these to get them next to each other, these divs. But they're actually going to appear next to each other anyways because we're using this float attribute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this float attribute allows you to do. So it's really an alternative to positioning. And you're going to want to use CSS floats a little bit sparingly because they do have kind of a behavior that's hard to really wrap your head around. And I think it behaves a little bit differently between browser to browser if you're not using them exactly right too. So you want to be really careful using these. But they are nice for like specific instances. So the main use of the CSS float is really just to get 2 block level elements next to each other, right? So it's this kind of challenge that we've been trying to overcome with positioning and now with floats. if you set the CSS float property, you can use 3 values, either left, right, or none. None basically removes floating. Left means that your element is going to move, it's going to float left until it hits another floated element or the edge of your document. If you float right, then that element is going to float right until it hits another floated element or the edge of the document as well. Okay, and I'll show you guys kind of what that means. There's a special behavior that happens when you do CSS floats. Just kind of like if you have debris in the water, the water is going to flow around that element. So if you set the value of an HTML element to float, other HTML elements like paragraphs or text in the paragraph is going to kind of float around that object. So floats are something that's really hard to describe with just words, so I'm just going to show you guys a demo. And you can just ask me questions if you have any questions. So let me show you a demo. Okay, so this is actually a paragraph, and there are 2 elements there that are floated. Okay, and why this is different than if we just had divs here normally is you'll see that this paragraph is not in the shape of a normal rectangle, right? It's actually kind of this weird shape, and it's basically what it's doing is it's accommodating the fact that this div is there. You guys see that? So the text basically floats around that element that you set the float value. Okay. And the main application of that is just to get 2 divs next to each other. So here are 2 divs, and they're both floated left. And when we view this, instead of the divs being under each other, they're going to appear next to each other. Yeah.
So on the first page, what's the bottom examples? Is that also coded?
Oh, that's actually clear, and I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so when you float an element, other elements are going to appear next to it, and they're just going to kind of accommodate it. So they're going to flow around it. But what if you don't want that behavior, right? How do you, once something's floated, how do you actually like stop that behavior? And the way that you do that is you use clear. So if you apply clear to a second paragraph, like in this example, so this paragraph isn't behaving like this paragraph, and that's because the clear attribute has been set on this, and it's basically going to appear on a new line if it encounters a float. So I know this is really confusing. Let me show you the code and see if that makes more sense. Okay. So here's that red div, and then we used to apply clear left. So that means that if this paragraph or this element encounters an element that's floated to the left, then it's going to put itself on a new line. So it means it's going to, just put on it. That's what kind of clear means. It's going to be on its own line. Okay. I know it's just kind of confusing. Do you guys get this? It's a little bit weird and funky, right? This is why it's hard to explain and it's kind of hard to use too. But it's nice for instances where you want. So in the button, we had the size of the middle element is going to scale to the size of the text inside it, right? So right now I think it says button, but if we wrote something shorter, like if we wrote text or something shorter in here, then this is actually going to scale down, and we want this cap to follow that. Okay, if we did this with positioning, like position absolute to get them next to each other, this is going to stay in the top right-hand corner of the button, and it's not going to actually just appear as if it was inline. So we kind of mimic inline with the float attribute.
How does it know how many pixels to scale to? Like when you said you use a shorter word, how would it know the proportion?
Right. So the way that it's set right now, we didn't define a height to it, and we didn't define a width to it.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen is you're just going to type in text, and that element naturally is going to expand and accommodate that text. So that's just the natural behavior of the HTML itself. And then the reason why we have white space here is we just added padding, or there should be padding, and then it'll create that white space first. So I know this is confusing. You guys are basically doing this exact same example in lab. Okay. so let's take a quick break, and there's actually two parts to the lab right now. The first part is setting up Photoshop, and you're going to basically be setting up the HTML and CSS for this button. After you guys are done with that lab, then we'll go into the Photoshop tutorial, and we'll just finish up with that at the end of the class. So just go ahead and start with the part one of the lab. Okay, so let's go back to just the Photoshop introduction. Okay, so just in the context of this course for Photoshop, we're really only going to spend the later half of this portion on it because we're mainly web design. We're going to teach you just in the next couple minutes, and you can refer to these slides after, how to do just the basic key things in Photoshop. And these are the things that Amber and John and I use all the time. So these are, I guess, the gold nuggets of what you have to know about Photoshop. And to learn more about Photoshop, there's just a lot of tutorials online, like tutorial9.net that we're using today. Just go on there, run through some of the tutorials, and you should have a pretty good grasp of Photoshop by the end of that. Did you?
Oh yeah, I'm just curious, like for a good web designer, do they actually draw their own things like using a tablet, or do you guys kind of just like steal images online, just Photoshop them?
I can't use a tablet for anything. I do everything with a mouse.
So like for people that can draw, there's still hope for us.
There is. I can't draw.
Okay, good.
I mean, like most of the stuff that you do for web design is like geometric shapes. So all I do is like the selection tool, make like a rectangle, make a circle. But I don't ever have to draw anything like by freehand. Logos are the one exception, but with logos I just kind of use text and transform it. So there is a way. Yeah, I can't draw. I don't know if I ever done. Are there any questions? So like, yeah, that's a good point though. So what we're going to teach you in this Photoshop tutorial isn't how to draw stuff, but it's going to be how to kind of jazz up your images or to apply certain effects to your Photoshop elements. So it's very applicable to just like layout design. Okay. So we're going to go over just kind of the workspace, how to modify existing images. We're going to go over the Photoshop panels, so the key panels that you're going to be using. And then we're going to just go over how to actually draw something in Photoshop, so to create some shapes and to just create some content. Okay. So you should set up your workspace in Lab, and it should basically look like this. And I'm not going to go through every one of these slides in the tutorial one by one because I think it'll just take a little bit of time. So I'm just going to go through them briefly. Okay, let's start. So here's just the labels and tools. Okay. So on the left-hand side, you basically have your toolbar, and there's a whole bunch of different things here. The first tool is the Move tool. So once you've selected something, and you can follow along on Photoshop if you have it open. Once you've selected something with the Select tool, which is just under it, you can just basically drag that object around and move it on your canvas. So this is what we call your canvas. Underneath that, there are three types of selection tools. There's the Rectangular Marquee tool, which lets you select just a rectangular portion of your image and manipulate it. And there's, I forget what it's called. I think it's like the magnetic something or other. It lets you just draw your own shape. And there's a Magic Wand tool and the Crop tool. So every time you try and manipulate something in Photoshop, first thing you have to do typically is select it first, and then apply whatever it is you're trying to apply to it. If you're trying to transform it, if you're trying to fill it with a color, you want to select it first. Okay. And in the bottom of your toolbar, and if you want to know like kind of what the strange looking tools there are over there, you can just mouse over them. And I'll give you a quick tool tip of what the tool does and then just try it out. The next important thing is in the bottom part of that toolbar, there's color swatches. So there's a foreground color and a background color. And if you click those colors, you can go through the color selector and you can change what your foreground color is and what your background color is. The foreground color is a color that that's going to be used when you fill something with a paint bucket or when you use the pencil tool or the brush tool. And the background color is used, I think, when you kind of delete things on a non-transparent background. The reason why we normally use the background color